Leading Ideas Talks is brought to you by the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Subscribe free to our weekly newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leading ideas. Leading Ideas Talks is also brought to you by Be the Welcoming Church. This video toolkit will help you develop a congregation-wide ethos of hospitality and institute best practices for greeting newcomers. Learn more and watch sample videos at churchleadership.com/shop. Is your congregation squeamish when it comes to evangelism? In this episode, Lewis Center Director F. Douglas Powe Jr. speaks with Dr. Priscilla Pope-Levison about her book, Models of Evangelism. They discuss how congregations can more authentically engage a variety of evangelistic practices with confidence and integrity.
Welcome to Leading Ideas Talks, a podcast featuring thought leaders and innovative practitioners. I am Douglas Powe, the director of the Lewis Center, and your host for this talk. Joining me is Dr. Priscilla Pope-Levison, who's the Associate Dean for External Programs and Professor of Ministerial Studies at Perkins School of Theology. Her latest book is Models of Evangelism. Our focus for this podcast, of course, is evangelism. Priscilla, welcome. I'm so excited you're joining us today.
Thank you, Doug. I am delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
I want to begin, before we actually jump directly into the book, with have you sort of share why do you believe it's important for those who are in the church to understand there are various models of evangelism? I think when people hear the word evangelism, all they think about is we just got to get people here to the church. So this idea that there's models of evangelism would seem strange to many church people.
I agree that it is strange, but I have found over how long have I been teaching evangelism? 25 years, that I started integrating models into the course so that students had a practical way to anchor the actual practice of evangelism, particularly as they went into churches. And I think it's also, Doug, my effort to dismantle fear or embarrassment or just all of the confusion over the word evangelism, to let people know that there's not just one way to do most any kind of ministry, and this applies to evangelism as well. So if you had the impression that evangelism is being a revival preacher, well, you're off the hook, because that's only one way to do evangelism. And so my hope by covering 8 models, and certainly this book is not exhaustive, is that each person can see themselves perhaps implementing one of the models, or maybe, as I suggest in the book, a combination of models that might fit their personality better. If they tend to be an introvert or don't want to do this alone, then there's small group evangelism that you do with a partner in crime, so to speak. So liturgical evangelism would also be another one, that if you don't feel comfortable talking directly to people, there are ways to integrate evangelism into the very worship life of the church. So that's my effort, to try to eliminate some of these barriers that people feel about evangelism by saying there's not just one way to do this.
I appreciate that. And I think that you're right on track. We're going to talk about some of those different models you named a little bit later, but I think it's critically important for people in the church to understand that there are ways to organically do evangelism that they may already be doing, yes, but haven't named. And the way you talk about models really helps to express that. So thank you for sharing that in the book and sharing that now. But I also want to sort of take a step into the book now, and you do get into this conversation. It's a conversation that in teaching evangelism, we all have had and continue to have, because we have students who, of course, come sort of with this way of thinking, is that evangelism is this sort of contested word that people don't like. They Here, then they almost just start frowning immediately. You can see their sort of facial expressions change. But at its root, evangelism means good news, good message. Why is it that something that literally means good news, folks shy away from?
Yeah. I think part of it, particularly in the American context, is the number of prominent evangelists that have fallen, so to speak. I mean, and we're not just talking like the 80s and 90s, but you think about Sinclair Lewis's novel Elmer Gantry in the 20s, and then Amy Semple McPherson and the kidnapping saga. Did that really happen or not? And so there's this, particularly for prominent revival evangelists, there's that fine line of when do they, in a sense, step into not having 100% integrity, for whatever reason, financial or sexual or political or whatever it is. And I think, though, I will say that I think oftentimes when you drill down into those fears, most individuals have not had a negative encounter with evangelism, but it's kind of in the air because we don't like sleazy preacher types or salespeople types. And so at the end of the book, I talk about, as I went back through each model and looked at what is a characteristic that is inclusive of all of the models. And I came up with 5: the hospitality, integrity, relationship, message bearing, and church rootedness. I think that integrity piece is so important because many people, including our 20-something kids, find Christians to be hypocritical because they say one thing and do another. And I think we could go a long way to clear up some of the misconception over the word evangelism that it really is good news if we are people who, to use the phrase, walk the talk or talk the walk, that there is this sense of integrity between the gospel message that we present and who we are as gospel bearers. It sounds simplistic, but Doug, I really think that would go a long way to recapturing evangelism as something that is positive and winsome and hospitable.
Let me stay in this vein just for a second and ask a follow-up. And I know you also have experienced this, that you have students who then goes to the other extreme, like so that evangelism basically becomes this thing where they quote the quote that is attributed to Saint Francis that he really didn't say, where they say, well, all I got to do is be a good person, and somehow it's going to rub off on everybody that means you can be a great Christian. So how do you find this middle ground of like, yeah, that sounds great, but you could be a great person, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to help people to understand that you're a great Christian or help with Christian formation. So how do you avoid that extreme while still trying to help people to understand the importance of integrity?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you know, that's how many people feel. And I was laughing because Jonathan Merritt's most recent book on God Talk, I can't remember, it's got a long name, takes on that quote, supposedly, that is St. Francis. And he said what that quote really misses is that St. Francis preached all the time, right. Verbally preached all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
Where that came home to me, your question, and I referenced this in the book, is one of my students asked me the question, and this was in the wake of, I forget, Hurricane Harvey, the one that really hit Houston a number of years ago. And she asked in class, and just wonderful student, smart, and she asked it in full, what should I say, integrity, in the sense that she really didn't know. She was asking if when she wore her church's, a t-shirt with her church's name on it, as they helped hurricane victims and people who had been homeless because of the hurricane and so forth, was that evangelism? And we talked about that for a while, because I think that's people think, as you say, that people will just know that they're a good person and that they go to church. So somehow they'll intuit that the gospel, or if we wear our T-shirt with, Saint First United Methodist Church, Dallas, or whatever. And I really pushed back on that, because I think that's a cop-out, that there is a time when a verbal presentation or a verbal something, even if that's, your own testimony of how God is active in your life or something, that's part of it. I mean, the euangelion, the Greek word, is a message. And it was written, as you know, in classical Greek, about a messenger who's coming into town with good news to tell of a important battle or the birth of a ruler or something. And it has a verbal component to it. And I think we may want to shy away from it, but I don't think wearing a T-shirt with your church's name is sufficient.
Thank you. I expect many will be disappointed by that response, but I agree with you and think it's important for people to hear that response.
It's a start. It's a start, and it can be a conduit to a conversation, certainly. Yes. But it's not enough on its own.
Right.
Because how would people know? I mean,
that's right.
Especially now, when we all know that we can't assume knowledge of Christianity anymore. How would they know? It reminds me of Paul. How would they know unless there's someone to tell them?
Right. And going back to your earlier point, how do they know I have integrity if I am not also demonstrating that, in the way that I'm sharing the message, not only with my T-shirt, but in the message, because they could assume I don't have integrity just when I have the T-shirt on. So you leave it open to too many assumptions. I want to dive into some of the models, and I want to begin with, you highlight the importance of small groups in our lives in general and in the church. And I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about how can we create evangelistic small groups that are not just a copy of sort of existing church groups. I mean, you hear congregations all the time saying, hey, we need small groups, and they oftentimes just become sort of fellowship groups.
Right.
But that's not what you're after. You're wanting people to actually create evangelistic small groups. So what are your sort of practical thoughts of how this can take place?
So you're absolutely right that the church has many fellowship groups. And one of the things that moving to Texas, what I found quite quickly is that people have been part of these Sunday schools, many of them since they were in their 20s, maybe newly married, maybe young kids, and then they stay with that group. And so they know each other intimately. And they've been together for 20, 30, 40 years. And many people will say they came into the church because of that Sunday school class. So they, in a way, they belong to the church, yes, but they belong to Epiphany, or whatever the name of the Sunday school is. And I think church growth has a really good point about new ports of entry, because how many people are going to feel comfortable coming into a group that knows each other so well? Most of us won't, because we don't know when you refer to your daughter by such and such a name. We don't know that maybe she's had a history that everybody else shares. So I think there's a couple reasons to start a new small group for evangelism. First of all, it's a new port of entry. And so everybody is on the same page in a sense. Secondly, about these small groups, their purpose is evangelism. That's their purpose. They are evangelistic small groups. They're not intended to be long-term. They're not intended to be a fellowship group that you stay with for the rest of your life. The whole point is to, and I got this from Dick Peace. I know and others who've written in small group evangelism, is that they're intended to be 4 to 8 weeks long, and really targeted on helping this group of people come to know Jesus. To be honest, that's what it is. And for those who do respond than like Salvation Army and others used to do. They take those recent converts who are enthusiastic about their new faith, and you pair them with an old timer, so to speak, and then they lead a group. And so there's this multiplication for these evangelistic small groups. So they're a very different kind of beast, so to speak, from the fellowship or the ongoing. And both are important, I think, in the life of a church or in the life of a parachurch organization. Both have their value.
Once again, we're talking with Priscilla Pope-Levison and talking about her new book, Models of Evangelism. And she was just sharing about small groups. I want to move on to another model, and I have to admit, I was laughing out loud a little bit, and I'm sure many will also laugh because we've also experienced this in our lives. You saw individuals out in your neighborhood going door to door, and you sort of quickly moved to another part of the house where they would not
get behind the front door.
Yeah, they would know you were there.
Yeah.
So, but even with all of that, this is the part that is somewhat surprising. You really believe in visitation evangelism, as you call it. Can you sort of share why you lift this up, even though your reaction is the exact same of a majority of the people in the United States when they see folk going door to door?
So let me just say, first off, that I'm lifting up models that I think have biblical roots. That's why I have a section in each chapter on biblical and theological roots. So visitation has been around, since the beginning of the Jewish Christian tradition, and certainly we see it in John Wesley and the early Methodists. So I try not to advocate for a model. I do more than report, so to speak, but I didn't feel like I could publish a book on evangelism without including visitation in it. However, having said that, I was really influenced by Dick Armstrong's. It's a very small book that he wrote in the 60s or 70s. When he was serving an inner city church in Philadelphia, called The Oak Lane Story. It's about Oak Lane Presbyterian. And in that, he recounts how the church was dying, the racial, economic demographics were changing, and the church could either turn inside out or turn inward, or and die, or they could embrace their neighborhood. And it's a fascinating story that the church decided to adopt a visitation campaign. And the changes that came to the church, not just to the neighborhood, are just fascinating. The church did become a different kind of church in terms of their demographic, but in terms of their giving, it's just the story. And so I was struck by that because the Greek word, I think it's episkeptomai for visitation, talks about God's care for like the sheep, or God's watching over. And visitation has this sense of care, of service, of coming alongside that, Doug, I'm really convinced that churches who tend to be fairly inward in their focus, if they opened their eyes and got to know their neighborhood, even if it wasn't a direct visitation campaign program, could really benefit the church and the community in ways that we could hardly imagine. And so seeing it through Dick Armstrong's perspective was really eye-opening for me. It's very different from James Kennedy's Evangelism Explosion, which is much more programmatic, and I think would turn people off. So I tried my best to give it a more positive spin, not because I've personally experienced a visitation campaign or led one, but because I wanted people to give it a second look and not just write it off.
And you've already been honest to say you've never led a
No,
visitation campaign.
no.
But can you share just your thoughts, given what you've just said of why you think it's important, of how a congregation can sort of do this with integrity? Because I think that's the challenge many are trying to figure out. So how do we get to know our neighbors without turning them off?
Yeah,
Because, the challenge is nobody wants somebody coming knocking on their door because you just don't know the timing. It could be,
right.
anything could be going on. So what are ways to sort of approach this practically without just immediately turning your neighbor off? Or do you have any thoughts in that direction?
Well, actually, Jack, my spouse, had a terrific idea about our own church that during COVID, it would have been really an interesting exercise, or just he's very creative, of having our choir, because our church does not know its neighborhood, and I don't know of anyone in the neighborhood, and it's the same. I mean, it's a white congregation in a white neighborhood, so we're not talking and socioeconomically middle to upper middle class. This is an educated congregation, and I just thought it was brilliant of what about, we're known for music. If our choir had, I mean, they did this kind of in Italy, with health workers and stuff, were to socially distance, and just walk the streets of our neighborhood, just singing, I mean, is that evangelism? I don't know. They're to what I said before. But I think more to your point is that beginning to break down just, or even to say, we're in this neighborhood along with you, and we want to bring you some beautiful music. I think there are ways if I were designing this, I would probably, as I suggest in the chapter, have some kind of, questions that I would ask, but I'd be really honest to say, if someone does open the door, we're from such and such a church. We really want to get to know our neighbors. That's our agenda. And, whether you ever come to our church or not. I mean, I talk about this in the book. Jack and I, since we moved to Texas, have gotten involved more politically. We were in Seattle, and now we're in Texas. And we did a lot of political campaigning several cycles ago to try to flip our district. And it worked. But, we made cold calls and all of that. And we were doing that for a political campaign. And we got some obnoxious, or we got some, threatening responses even. But we also had really some wonderful conversations. And it just seems to me that why are Christians hesitant to knock on doors for conversation, or I don't know. It just struck me that we'll do that in a political season, and be ready for the vitriol. But it also led to some really interesting conversations. So I know that's a very jumbled response, but I hope that some of those ideas might catch hold with people.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and I think it's helpful. I like the idea actually of the choir, because if people do come out, there is an opportunity to then have even a brief conversation with them to say, hey, we're going to do this on Saturdays, and you're welcome to join us. I mean, it's an opportunity, of course, understanding COVID restrictions, but it does create some great opportunities. I want to stick sort of, you just used a choir, and think about worship, because worship is central. And you use this term that I think many would not be as familiar with, which is liturgical evangelism. And as you think of the decline of mainline denominations in particular, how effective do you think liturgical evangelism can be as we move forward?
How effective? Well, I think particularly for those churches, and I would include most United Methodist churches in that. I mean, most churches have a certain rhythm or a framework to their worship that could easily have some evangelistic moments integrated into it. Or, the reason it's called liturgical evangelism is it's the marrying of this liturgical mindset with evangelism, which I think is a really interesting one, because we tend to think of highly liturgical churches as not being evangelistic. And this is a way to keep true to who they are as liturgically high churches, if you want to call it that, and also have a commitment to evangelism. And what I like about this is that this goes back to the roots of the early church and Hippolytus's apostolic tradition. And just as we talk about like the hours of the day that many in monastic communities mark, so this is taking seriously the church year. So already your people are living by a different sense of time. And to integrate, as this does, it's highly scripted. It's a highly scripted model, evangelism into Advent and then into Lent and so forth. It's I think a church could start simply by bringing evangelism to the fore in different ways during those seasons. So yes, it does depend on people being in worship. So the assumption is that this is taking place during corporate worship. And but Doug, what I like about it is that it takes seriously the catechetical experience of worship, that we are teaching something, and we are teaching God's salvation history. And people can kind of hear the gospel in ways very different from maybe Visitation or one-on-one, where it's kind of right in your face. They can hear it like almost like eavesdropping. If we're attentive to presenting the gospel on a regular basis and lifting up God's plan for salvation, what I like about this is that people kind of grow into conversion rather than that kind of paradigmatic moment of conversion, which I think this sense of a slower burn, so to speak, fits our contemporary context much more than the revival mentality. So, I'm putting a positive spin on each of these because I want people to be intrigued.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I really love the language of eavesdropping. It's something that, I think that's a great term. So you should hold on to that. That's good. That's good language.
Well, but I mean, if we think of each part of worship, what could be the evangelistic component of the call to worship, or even the offertory? There, and I think that would be a place to start if people want to think about integrating worship, evangelism into worship.
Yeah, that's good. You use a term that certainly fits for the day, media evangelism. Can you share a little bit more with our listeners about media evangelism?
Oh, gosh. This is the one that I struggled with the most, because I am not really... I kind of dabble with Facebook every so often when I think I have a little time. So it was just ironic but I felt like this chapter had to be in the book, not only for contemporary social media, but also when you think about media just in its simple definition of tools of communication. This is intrinsic to evangelism. Evangelism has to incorporate tools of communication. So, you're thinking of, we're thinking of television and radio, and of course now with internet and social media. So I had several people who are much more conversant with social media than I am read this chapter. And this was the one that I learned the most about because I'm just not involved in it. What I do think is that, especially we've learned this even more so during COVID, is that a church's website is the window that the world sees. And if a church reads that chapter and does nothing else but really update and be what's the word I want? Really keeping their website, conversing with people, making sure that their website is user friendly, is stranger friendly, so to speak. That sounds kind of creepy, but you know what I'm saying. That so much of a church's website is often again, it's this for this internal group. No. Think of a website as how you want to interact with the world, because that's what we're doing. I mean, people are going online, they're live streaming, with as much as Jack and I have moved, we come to a new city and we do a Google search of churches. And if nothing else, think about the website, not only as inviting people in who don't know you, be sure service times, add, directions, all of that, but also, is there any testimony that you could provide of how God is active in your congregation, or something that bridges the gospel in your website, even if it's that simple? I go into Twitter and Instagram and all of that only because many organizations and churches are using media for evangelism. Again, it's not something that I've had experience with. But I feel like the people who read the chapter and just my own research and thinking about it, there's a lot of good wisdom in there.
Well, Priscilla, this has been great, but as we get ready to draw to an end, let me ask you sort of a question that pushes you to think towards the future. So in a perfect world, you can even use your own congregation, after someone reads this book, what are the next 3 steps you would hope they would take as they start thinking about these different models of evangelism?
Okay, so that wasn't one of your questions, Doug.
No, it was not.
Okay, so what are the first 3 steps that I would like a congregation to take? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. First of all, I would like as many people in the congregation to become comfortable, at ease with talking to others about even how they see God in their own life and their church's life. So I'm very fortunate. We received a grant from the Lilly Foundation called Testimony as Community Engagement. And that's very much on my mind right now, because I think our story is written into God's story. And I think that our story is a way that can more easily connect with people than, say, the 4 spiritual laws or something that's more content driven. Where storytelling is alive and well right now. And a lot of that is because in COVID, that's, we missed each other, and so we were longing to hear stories, and that often happened, virtually. So I think the first thing is becoming much more comfortable. We don't even have to call it evangelism, but talking about God's activity in our human life right now. I think secondly, I would hope that a church would do a deep dive into the models and say, which 1 or 2 best fits us now that we could honestly see ourselves incorporating in the next year of our life. And then third, I would, not a committee, but I would really convene groups of people praying and interacting on what this idea of testimony and churches taking on some of these models, what this would really mean, not only for the church, but in the community. I'm really convinced that churches many of them have lost contact with their neighborhood, their location. And so I don't want to forget that component. So the 3 would be testimony, which model or two could this church really feasibly take on? They may want to do something else, but what do they really have capacity and courage for at this moment? And then really bathing it all in prayer and listening, Lectio Divina, scripture study, just because I just believe that God works and God responds to our pleadings and our prayers. And I don't know. I mean, you and others have written so much more and better on this, but those three come to mind as places that a church could feasibly start, no matter whether they have big budgets or that just is not important. It's, do you have the capacity and the courage to begin or to really continue in a much more radical way, being God's instruments in the world?
Yeah, no, that's it exactly. And I think you stated it well. Well, thank you. I appreciate having this time with you. And it was a great conversation. And it's a great book,
Doug,
Models of Evangelism. People need to read it.
It's great to see you. Thank you. How long have we known each other?
Too many years.
Yes, we were much younger then.
Yes.
Thank you for the invitation. This has just been wonderful.
On the next Leading Ideas Talks, Major General Randy Manner shares advice on leading during challenging times.
In today's environment, it's really very important that leaders in the church do the very best you can to both listen to the concerns of your parishioners and to be able to ask them, what are the sources that you might believe in and how can you find out what the truth is? I know it sounds very simple to say those words, but it actually is very important. Having a balanced perspective with multiple sources of information will always yield a better result or a better answer. Anytime we rely on singularly one person or one source, you potentially could fall victim to either propaganda, misinformation, or misguided belief.
Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe free to our weekly newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leadingideas.